Very good evening to one and all. Today, this class is for class 9, pollination and fertilization. And we will be dealing with few topics today. As we all know, yesterday we have started the pollination and fertilization chapter. So today our topic is wind pollination in maize, insect pollination in salvia, water pollination in Vallisneria. Means how maize, salvia and Vallisneria are pollinated by wind, then insect and water respectively. Now, apart from that, today's topic is fertilization, double fertilization and triple fusion also we shall learn. So, starting today's proceedings, the first point is wind pollination in maize. So, whenever we will have a close look at the maize plant, we can find the maize is actually having two kinds of flower, male and female. So, two kinds of flower are present in maize. The male flower is known as the tassels, which is grown at the upper part of the plant, and the female flower is known as cobs, which is grown at the sideways bottom part of the plant. Now these tassels are the male flower which is producing the pollen, and the cobs are the female flower which is ready to receive the pollen grain. But here one twist is there. In maize flower, the tassel, the anther part will mature very soon as compared to that of the female flower. That is the female part. So what happens? The self-pollination will be restricted here. And the pollen grains so produced by the tassels are generally either lighter or heavier. Two kinds of pollen they are producing. Lighter and heavier both. So even a gentle blow of wind can carry some light or heavier pollen grain. But they will never pollinate, the pollen grain will never pollinate the same flower of the same plant because self-pollination is restricted. Why? What is the reason behind? The tassels are maturing earlier than the cobs. Means the male flower are maturing earlier than the female flower. Male flower maturing early means they are producing the pollen grain, and female flower not maturing early means they are not ready to accept the pollen grain. But the adjacent plant, the plant which is quite far, the same maize plant, the another maize plant which is quite far from the particular maize plant which is producing the pollen, it is also having the female flower because all the maize plants are bisexual. So definitely the pollen grain from one maize will be carried by the wind to the different maize plant, and the different female flower will be pollinated. And then after pollination, the fertilization will take place and we can get a good amount of fruit. Maize is actually means it is known as grain. It is neither fruit nor a crop. So it is considered as a grain only. So we can eat it after the fertilization process. Now, this is what happens in the wind pollination in maize. Next is insect pollination in salvia. Salvia is a flower which is bilipped. Bilipped flower means it is having two layers of corolla, petals. The petals has got two layers. The upper layer, it is having stamens as well as the female part, that is the stigma, that is unified there in the corolla itself. So stamen as well as stigma is there at the upper level of the corolla, upper part of the corolla, and the bottom part is acting as a platform so that the insect could come and sit. But here one twist is there. What we need to know over here? Here what happens? There are two kinds of male reproductive part present in the salvia flower. One male reproductive part will produce the pollen grain. Other male reproductive part won't be producing the pollen grain. Means one male reproductive part will be fertile. Another male reproductive part will be infertile. One is producing pollen grain. Another one is not producing pollen grain. Then what is the reason behind? The reason behind is that moment the insect will be sitting on the lower platform of the salvia flower, the moment the insect with its proboscis or tentacle will inject, when the proboscis or the tentacles of the insect will be injected into the female part of the flower, at that time what happen? The infertile stamen will move back, and the fertile stamen will come front. That fertile stamen will touch the body of the insect, and while touching, what it will do? It will dust some pollen grains there. Now when the same insect will go to the different female flower, that pollen will be dusted into the female salvia flower, and then the fertilization process will be going on. So this is what happens in the salvia flower. Now next is the water pollination in Vallisneria. The water pollination in Vallisneria. How the water pollination is taking place in Vallisneria. So Vallisneria is a kind of plant which is producing two kinds of flower, male and female. Once the male flower is mature, it will be set free on the water to float. The male flower will be set free on the water, on the surface of the water to float. Now this male flower will be starting to float. Now when the female flower is mature, it will be from the bottom of the water surface, it will slowly grow to the upper surface of the water. From the bottom of the water surface, the female flower will grow to the top surface, upper level of the water. Now what will happen? The male flower is already floating. The female flower is also matured and it is present at the surface of the water. Now it is present and it is having a cup shaped. After maturing of the female Vallisneria flower, it is becoming a cup shaped. Now what happens? Cup shaped but filled with water. When the female Vallisneria flower matures, it becomes cup shaped and it will be full of water. Now what happens? This male flower will float and go near to the female flower. Now the moment it will come in contact with the female flower, since it's cup shaped, the female flower is matured and it is cup shaped and filled with water, the male flower will set itself. The moment the contact will be done, the moment the contact is completed between the male Vallisneria and the female Vallisneria, the male flower will transfer the pollen grain to the female flower, because it is cup shaped depression like this. Cup shaped depression is like this kind of depression, and which is filled with water, the female Vallisneria, and here the male flower will come and have a contact. And finally what will happen? The pollen grain will be given to the female flower and pollination is done. Now what is there after pollination? What is after pollination? After pollination, the process called fertilization occurs. That is very important thing we need to understand, and it is much more technical than pollination. We need to understand. So please be patient and listen to the video properly. So what happens? See, next is the fertilization. The fertilization means the moment the pollen grain, see, I have made a structure of a fertilization or structure of an ovary which is having the pollination. Means pollination is done, pollen grain is sitting over here, and then now the fertilization process has been continued. So this is pollen, stigma, pollen tube, style, polar nuclei, ovule, micropyle, two male nuclei, ovary wall, embryo sac, egg cell, tube nucleus and ovary. But before going to the fertilization, two things we need to know. First of all, the structure of pollen grain. Whenever we are seeing the pollen grain under microscope, there are two layers of a pollen grain. The outer layer is the exine and the inner layer is the intine or intino. Intine or intino. As well as the pollen grain consists of two nucleus, tube nucleus and generative nucleus. Now, apart from this, we need to understand also the structure of ovule. Before that, we need to understand, there is one means proper explanation. The ovule after fertilization will become seed. The ovary after the process of fertilization will become the fruit. This is the basic concept, the thumb rule of pollination and fertilization. The ovule will mature to form a seed. The ovary will mature to form a fruit. Now, what happens? So now after understanding the structure of pollen grain, we must also know what is the structure of the ovule. When we are seeing the ovule, the outer covering of the ovule is called as integuments. Integuments. The outer covering of the ovule is called as the integuments. And inside the ovule, when we are going, we are finding nucleus, as well as when we are going more inside the nucleus, we can find the embryo sac. Now what happens? The pollen grain is having the two male nuclei. Now this male nuclei of the pollen grain will fertilize the egg to form the embryo. This is what happening. So ovule will convert into seed, ovule will mature after fertilization to form seed, and ovary will become the fruit. Complete ovule will become seed, complete ovary will become the fruit. Now see what happens. This pollen, now we are coming to the technical part of the fertilization. This pollen, when it will sit on the female reproductive part, that is, when it will sit on the stigma. Since pollen is coming from a far place, the stigma will offer the pollen grain some sugary syrup. Those sugary syrup, the pollen grain will absorb and it will form the pollen tube. This is the pollen tube. So pollen sitting on the stigma, forming the pollen tube by drinking the sugary syrup offered by the female reproductive parts. Now, this pollen tube will continue to grow and it will penetrate the ovary. Through the style, the pollen tube will continue to grow and it will penetrate the ovary. Now, the ovule is having a very minute part. The ovule inside is having a very minute gapping. So we know the covering of the ovule is called as integuments. But where the integument is absent, that part is known as the micropyle. That micropyle allows the pollen tube to enter. Now here what happens? The pollen tube entered. Pollen tube is carrying two male nuclei. The pollen tube is carrying two male nuclei. So this is the two male nuclei. Here I have written for you two male nuclei. Now what happens? The pollen grain came, sat on the stigma. Now of the stigma or the female reproductive part offered some sugary syrup to the pollen grain. Pollen grain forms the pollen tube carrying the two male nuclei. Now here comes a different part. What happens? First male nuclei will fertilize the egg. So first male nuclei will fertilize the egg. So here is the egg cell. First male nuclei will fertilize the egg. Here is the egg cell, and that fertilization will give rise to the zygote. Now that zygote will grow into a new plant. I repeat, that zygote will grow into a new plant. So first male nuclei fertilizes the egg cell, and egg cell forms zygote, and zygote will convert to form zygote will mature or develop to form a new plant. First thing. Second thing, the other male nuclei, so two male nuclei, one is here and one is here. So this will go and fertilize the egg cell. Zygote will form, zygote will convert to form a new plant. The male nuclei which is here, that male nuclei will slowly go to the polar nuclei. There are two polar nuclei. Here I have written, I think, the polar nuclei is here. Yes. Two polar nuclei are there. I have written polar nuclei. Two are there. So the male nuclei which is at the back, this male nuclei will slowly go to the polar nuclei and it will fertilize the polar nuclei to form endosperm. Now what is this endosperm? This endosperm is actually a layer of food which must be formed so that the zygote could take the food from the endosperm and can grow into a new plant. So here comes the main part, why it is called as double fertilization and triple fusion. Why double fertilization? Because two male nuclei, one male nuclei is going and fertilizing the egg cell, forming the zygote. Zygote will develop to form a plant. First fertilization over. Second fertilization is this male nuclei is going to the two polar nuclei and fertilizing it, and that two polar nuclei is becoming the endosperm. So how many fertilization? Two. But why triple fusion is writing? Triple fusion is written because when this male nuclei which is at the back, when this male nuclei is fertilizing the two polar nuclei. So one male nuclei plus two polar nuclei, it is equal to 3. 1 plus 2 is equal to 3. So that is why it is known as triple fusion. Why double fertilization? Because two male nuclei fertilizing one egg cell and two polar nuclei. Why triple fusion? Because two polar nuclei is fertilized by one male nuclei. That is why it is known as triple fusion or double fertilization. Now, here comes the end. That is what happens in fertilization. I guess you understood this. If at all any doubts, you can ask. Now, next is what happens after fertilization. What happens after fertilization? The after fertilization, the sepals or calyx will wither off. Wither off means it will shed down. Shed down. It will shed from the flower or from the fruit, whatever is formed. Not flower exactly, fruit only. So the sepals and the petals will shed, but sometimes in tomato we can see that at the base of the tomato still the green leaves are there, that is sepals are still there, but petals definitely it will shed off. Anther shed off. Anther will also fall down. Stigma fall down. Stigma will also fall down. So male part, female part will fall down. Petals fall down. In some cases sepals may be there. But when we are talking about ovule, what happens to the ovule? Ovule will become seed. The covering of the ovule integuments, it will become the seed coat. What happens to the ovary? The ovary will become the fruit. The covering of the ovary will now become pericarp. We can call it as pericarp. The covering of the ovary will now be called as pericarp. So pericarp is formed as the covering of the fruit. Outer covering of the fruit is called as the pericarp. So this is what happens after fertilization. So I hope you can understand through this video, and if any doubts you can ask. I think it's clear for you. If any doubts, students can ask and go through the video, match it with the text. If any problem, please ask. Please go through the diagrams labeled properly for you. Thanks a lot.